Professor Chigner. I was a missionary in China for the people in China from 1920s and 1930s. I was born September the 9th, 1897 in Wellsville, New York. In 1921, I graduated from Concordia Lutheran Seminary in St. Louis and received a call to China. Pretty much of a shocker for my family, along with 4 other classmates. I attended language school when I arrived in China, which took a long time. It go by ship and it takes a month. But I did language school in Peking in the fall of 1921, now Beijing. Some of you have been there. Before I left for China, I met someone in the house right behind you there, which is there. Now it's a fellowship hall. But that was Pastor Hardenberger's home. He was the pastor here at the time. And I, Max, came out from the seminary with a couple of my buddies because Hardenbergers were our friends. And I came to that party that night, a single man. And I left meeting Helen Rathard. She was a seamstress for my grandfather, father-in-law to be, at the Rathard clothing store. Remember where Bimmy sold Levi's? That's what they say in these days. I never met Bimmy. And anyway, I asked her finally, we courted because I took off for China shortly after that party. Stopped in Wellsville, New York, and a few other stops. And then I off to China for the long voyage. I courted Helen by mail. And believe it or not, she accepted. She accepted my invitation to be my bride. And she came over to China in the company of other missionaries in October of 22. In those days, again, it took a month for her to arrive. I thought it was a year. While in China, my 20-some years, the Lord gave me to be a missionary till my young death occurred. I had 4 sons. A junior, who is buried right here, also a missionary to Japan, Max Jr., and then Martin, still living in St. Louis, married Doris Giebert. Arthur, who just passed away this past year, and Carl. I was the little guy. And by the way, I want to say this about Carl while I'm here. He's the one who picked out this silly hat for me to wear today from the museum, the great museum in Redbud that I'll never get to see. But I think he chose that because he thought that would help, and he had nothing left for my clergy clothing. So my first China serving was 1922 to 27, and then you always had a furlough, which you would call kind of a vacation, and that took a month to get back and a month to go. Long missionaries hated to be away that long. Then in March 1927, the missionary families were evacuated from Hankow because of communist, anti-foreign, and anti-Christian attitude. But in 1927, Hankow was taken back by General Chiang Kai-shek, who was the president of China, and the missionaries could move back to Hankow. Then we had a big flood. Oh my goodness. The flood was so heavy we had to move all the furniture to the top floor of our little homes and the seminary itself. But we returned to Hankow in 1931. In 1932, I had the honor of being the first president elected to the new Chinese seminary. And at that time, we received General Chiang Kai-shek as a guest at the seminary. It was at that time Mrs. Chiang Kai-shek held our baby Carl and burped him. I should explain that. When General Isimo's automobiles came into our compound, they were in an open car, and they arrived with our welcoming committee, and I welcomed them as I felt I should do. And Mrs. Chiang Kai-shek stood up in the car and said, "Little American baby." And it was like Lion King. My mother held me out. And she took me in her arms briefly, and Max, my brother, oldest brother, said I might have burped. So for years we tried to get on You've Got a Secret, burped by Madame Jung Kai-shek. But never. June 1936 to February 37 marked the second furlough. Then began my third term in China. The increased war was going on. Frequently we had Chinese soldiers all around our home with bushes in their back trying to protect the Chinese area. Then we returned to USA for a rest due to health problems of Helen when I traveled back alone in 1939 because of Helen's weakness from surgery. Plans were that she and the boys would follow later. I followed missionary, went back with Kurt Fuss, Mertens, and Wangers, traveled back to Wanshen. Quite a trip. We went through the back hills of China on steamers, and then we had to buy a ship for a certain area to get through, to finally back on a steamer boat, and the next day we were going to hit Wanshen. On the last night of the traveling in a small steamer boat, I became ill, and I fell in and out of consciousness. They tried to get a Chinese doctor from a village. They saw lights. He came finally in the morning early, but couldn't speak English and helped a little bit, he thought, and then left. I was called home on that night, January 23rd, at the age of 41, young. Mother sat there with 4 little boys. Service was held, and Mother, your pardon, was back in the United States because of her surgery. Dad was by himself in China. The service was held at the seminary 2 days later, and they sang Beautiful Savior, my favorite hymn. I was buried now in Wanshen, China. You will note on the stone, and the stone that we're honoring today is this small stone. And it says on it, Helen Marie Chigner, and then below it, she was kind enough to add my name, memory of Reverend Max Chigner in Wanshen, China. Thank you very much for listening.